Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today. And in this programme we'll be asking, should the British government and should the Metropolitan Police allow the mass Palestinian protest to take place this weekend during Remembrance weekend, and particularly as Saturday is Armistice Day. And in this programme today I'm joined by Hugh Kitson, who is producer and director of the famous Hatikva films together with Whose Land documentary, and together with Alistair Scott, the UK director for Vision for Israel, also known as the UK as Joseph Storehouse. So gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Very good to see you both. But I'll start off with you, Alistair, because we know that ever since Saturday the 7th of October, not only has Israel changed, but it almost feels as if the world has changed as well, as Israel was at the end of the biggest mass terrorist attack in its history, that more Jewish people died on that day than we haven't seen since the Holocaust for over 80 years. So what are your thoughts and what are your impressions of that day that will go down in infamy on Saturday the 7th of October 2023?
It's unbelievable. I mean, I can remember to this day, and it still makes me tingle, when the reports started to come out, and then the film, which came slightly later. And it's, you know, all of us who kind of have been to Israel and work with Jews and the Gentiles in the nation, you kind of know there's the potential of this happening at any time, particularly coming out of Gaza with the rocket attacks. But what we saw was beyond anything you could imagine. It's the equivalent of a 9/11. It's the equivalent of, you know, it's one of those days like John F. Kennedy when he was shot. You'll remember this for many, many years, for probably forever, what we were doing on that day. And it's horrendous. And our job as believers is to continue to pray for God to intervene in this whole situation. There's so much suffering going on in the land, and you know, we don't belittle the problems that are happening the other side of the border in Gaza. And I know this death is death, and there's a large number of deaths going on. And it's the accusation of it being sort of a revenge coming back. It's just not the truth. It's just they have to secure their borders. They have to secure. They've always said, every prime minister from the very beginning of 1948 has said, never again will we allow another Holocaust. This was the nearest thing we've seen to Holocaust, and the way the nations of the world are reacting is kind of frightening.
Absolutely. And Hugh, it's great to see you back on the programme, so thank you for joining us. And Hugh, if we take ourselves back a month ago, as of this recording, that literally over 1,400 Israelis have been murdered by Hamas. We also see that between 240 and 300 have been kidnapped and taken to Gaza. And then we're seeing some in the region of over 4,000 casualties, and many of those are critical, as well as probably in the region of 400 IDF soldiers being killed. And this can be described as a pogrom, a genocide, a massacre, a war crime committed by Hamas. But what are your thoughts on the day that was Saturday, the 7th of October?
Well, I believe it's reminiscent of the Shoah itself. 20 odd years ago, I made a film called Lest We Forget. And one of the Holocaust survivors, she'd been in Auschwitz, that we interviewed, she said she saw German soldiers smashing babies' heads against brick walls. And she encountered Dr. Yosef Mengele on one occasion. And he used to experiment with Jewish people, all sorts of medical experiments when they were conscious, alive, including limb amputations, to see how they fared. And it's that sort of evil viciousness that the Hamas terrorists operated with. It's just beggars belief. I've actually seen some of the footage from first responders that went in, as well as some of the GoPro footage that some of the terrorists were wearing. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I've seen it as well. It's absolutely heartbreaking, and the lies are now coming out that this didn't happen, that this is propaganda. Sorry, you only have to go to Kafar Asher to realise that this is not propaganda by any stretch of the imagination. But Alistair, what are your thoughts on whether the government and our Metropolitan Police Force should allow the mass Palestinian protest to take place, particularly during Armistice Day as well as the Remembrance weekend, where we remember those who have sacrificed their life for our freedoms, both in the First and also in the Second World War as well?
I think it's the simple answer is it should never be allowed, but let's go into a little bit more detail, because this has been a special day of remembrance of those who gave their lives over several wars and over several decades, and it's supposed to be a peaceful event. It's supposed to be one of those events where there's a lot of respect and honor being paid to not only the ones who gave their lives, but the families that remain. You know, there'll be grandparents, there'll be children, their sons, and so on, who are being honoured in that special day, the danger of it. I mean, you had a recent event where you were in the midst of one of these protests. I've been in several of those in the past where we've been out there with teams giving, just going out as an outreach in London, and you see the hostility that rises up from certain groups. I think for the Metropolitan Police, they will realise the potential of real trouble brewing and injuries and possible deaths as well coming forth where these groups may conflict and reach together at some point. The government already has shown that they are not keen on this happening. They are trying to give people the choice, don't do it. But what I read just this morning is that they're going to come along with their protests against while the armistice work is going on in the Cenotaph. And it's potentially a very, very dangerous weekend. I know there'll be many, many believers, and we'll be praying for sure. I have an outreach event somewhere else, but we'll be praying for peace on the streets of London. But it's one of those places, be prayerful, be careful if you feel the Lord's telling you to go out there and be on the right side or the left side, whatever you want to call it. But I would say it's a potentially very dangerous weekend, and I would ask our politicians to take every step they can to stop this event from happening.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned that I was there, and I managed to, after a speaking engagement in Westminster, walk through that demonstration. It was scary. And not only was it scary, it's like you were coming face to face with evil, and the incitement, the anti-Semitism, was absolutely horrific. I always wondered what it would be like to actually have been in Munich in the early 1930s with one of those Nazi rallies going on, and I got a taste of it a few weeks ago in our streets. That's essentially how I felt, walking through the midst of these people with hatred in their eyes, I didn't hear any chants of jihad, but I know that weekend there were chants of jihad, which is absolutely horrific. And Hugh, you have a lot of military connections, particularly with your family as well. So share with us why Armistice Day and Remembrance Day are so important to the nation, and why this shouldn't be overshadowed by the Palestinian cause that was wrapped up in concern for Gaza, but reality is nothing but a hate fest against the Jewish people in Israel.
Well, I do totally agree with you in that. But, Armistice Day, I forget when the first one was. It was 101.
20s.
It was the early 1920s, so it's been going for about 100 years. And the whole purpose of it is to remember those who sacrificed their lives. If I can put it this way, it was to preserve our Judeo-Christian heritage. Certainly Hitler was wanting to destroy that, and Churchill knew it. And what is going on the other side with this pro-Palestinian demonstration, which ostensibly is to call for a ceasefire, they're calling for just one side to cease firing, Israel, but I've not heard any calls for for Hamas to release the hostages or for them to stop firing rockets into Israel.
Well, release the hostages. Surely that's the first thing.
Yeah, that's the first thing. But I mean, so often in the past there's been these short ceasefires and Israel ceases and Hamas fires. And that's the way it is. But the whole, it's two very, very conflicting things. And if I can put it this way, the First World War, I believe to some extent was a just war. Millions were killed on the battlefield. The Second World War absolutely was a just war. Hitler had to be got rid of. Now, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and some refer to him as the grandfather of the Palestinian movement, he was siding with Hitler, and his whole ambition was to carry the final solution, so-called, right through the Middle East. God intervened to stop that at the Battle of El Alamein. And so you've got two conflicting things going on, and I totally agree with you, Alistair. I think the government have to get tough and stop this happening this weekend, because there could be real trouble.
And this is when we get, just going on from what you're saying there, Hugh, this is when we get the birth of Islo-fascism. That merger of Islamic extremism with the Muslim Brotherhood, together with the influx of Nazi ideology, is pretty much decades in the creation, and we're seeing the fruits of it now. And he also, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, also had his own SS division in the Balkans, which they're all kind of Muslim soldiers ready to fight for jihad and genocide against the Jewish people in the British Mandate of Palestine. But Alistair, you know, when we look at the big Palestinian marches and demonstrations, and we hear chants of Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, and we know that it's Israel that is in the middle, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, is the nation of Israel. When they say free, free Palestine, they're not referring to wanting an independent Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria, or what the world calls as the West Bank, but the complete eradication of the nation of Israel, which is effectively calling for genocide on our streets. So effectively, this is very similar climate that we're feeling in the 1930s. But to put things in perspective, particularly as we remember Remembrance Day, just want to give the figures of those who fell during the Second World War, so who sacrificed their freedom and their lives for the freedom that we have today. So according to the government's own website, there were 384,000 British soldiers who were killed in combat, and 70,000 civilians died, and 40,000 were killed in the Blitz alone. Surely if we have to learn something from history, is that we can't allow evil to rise, and particularly ideologies that at its core has Jew hatred at its core, to be on our streets and our capitals, chanting jihad and shouts of genocide against the Jewish people and the nation of Israel.
Yeah, it's such a worrying thing when you see the protests in the streets, because yes, there are some of those who are out of the Palestinian background or out of the Arab background with the flags waving and everything else, but a lot of them are young British people, even some of those who are Arabs who have been born in this country, and yet we forget so easily the fact that they are calling for Palestine to be free, but at the expense of the Jewish people. So basically we're saying they can be sacrificed.
And that's 7 million people. That's 7 million Jewish people living in Israel, and effectively that would be another Holocaust.
And if it wasn't for the Holocaust, that 7 million would have been 70 million, because, or 50 million, I'm speculating at numbers, but so many, 6 million died in the war because they didn't have a safe place to be. Now they have a safe refuge. This little piece of land, it's a pinprick on the globe. And yet the nations are criticizing them, or not so much the leaders. The leaders are understanding, or a lot of the leaders are understanding, that Israel has a right to defend its people. But you can see there's a shift going from how they defend, and the collateral damage of lives. Lives are lives. They're never collateral damage. We know that. But the concern is to see how we are willing to And our younger people who don't seem to understand what they are actually, when they're chanting these things out, genocide, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. But what is the price? What are they saying would be done with the Jewish people who lived there, who were given that land by the United Nations, pre-United Nations, by the League of Nations, and it's been carried forth with when the United Nations were formed. And this constant talk about having a two-state solution, that, a Palestinian state alongside Israel. But the Palestinians don't want that. Their charter is, as they're crying out in the streets, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They do not want to be alongside an Israel of Jewish people. They want the world. It's the same spirit that was there with Hitler, to be free of Judaism. And we need to wake up. I mean, as Christians, we need to stand up and do what Isaiah 62 verse 6 and 7 tells us. Do not be silent. Confront these things that are lies and deception that are coming forth, and actually let's make ourselves available, particularly for the Jewish people who are so afraid. You talked about your experience in the streets at that protest. How about the Jewish people? They don't really want to go to school. They're being barracked in universities. How is it for them? Can you imagine? You can't even begin to imagine how tough that is. But we need to wake up, and we need to confront our MPs and make sure this weekend, particularly because we're focusing on that, should not go ahead, because I think it's desperately dangerous. But also, let's talk to our politicians and say, look, there isn't a place for a two-state solution because one part of that state doesn't want it to happen.
Yeah,
want freedom from it.
No, absolutely. And Hugh, our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who's been very strong for Israel during this whole conflict, has actually warned there is a clear and present risk that the Cenotaph in Whitehall and other memorials could be desecrated during this march. If the Prime Minister is deeply concerned, then why can't this be stopped?
Well, I wish I could answer that question, but I think there's a real fear of the backlash of stopping it. So I would ask the question, what is better, to actually deal with it and stop it legally, than let it go ahead and let all this damage occur. We were talking just before we started doing the program about the night that this goes out, the 9th of November, actually being the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht. And it's almost as if we're facing, over this coming weekend, a similar thing. Are we going to allow this sort of Jew hatred to continue, or are we going to confront it? And of course, Kristallnacht is generally regarded as the starting point of the Shoah. We need to take a stand, and I believe that the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary need to get this march, this pro-Palestinian march, banned.
Absolutely. And Alistair, if the planned Palestinian marches go ahead this weekend in London, and they take place over the weekend of Armistice Day and Memorial Weekend, particularly Memorial Sunday, will this not be a wake-up call for the British people to realise that those who are demonstrating on the streets, who are chanting Jihad on the streets, who are calling for genocide against Israel and the Jewish people, effectively do not care anything about our heritage, our history, or our values, and don't realise that what is actually taking place is a direct threat to our liberty and also our national security?
Absolutely. I mean, it is one of those ridiculous situations if it does go ahead. Instead of being a time of marking and remembering the peace that came and the freedom that came to Europe and the world, really, as a result of the two world wars, and having this special day of remembrance to honor. I mean, there were, I've been to some of these in the past where you see the elderly remaining soldiers who fought the Second World War, particularly, walking through, and the thought of that being infiltrated, I suppose that's the word to make, by people chanting slogans which are which are derogatory, which are anti-Israel, anti-Jew, anti even our own, as you say, our own legacy as a nation. I think, you know, for sure it needs to be stopped. I heard that if it does go ahead and the protests go ahead, there will be a lot of the armed forces out on the streets just trying to keep things in control. And I mean, that's just not what it's meant to be. Armistice weekend is not meant to be about trying to stop another war happening in the streets. It's about recognizing, honoring all the things that have happened in our history. And we must do everything we can to make sure that that weekend is honored.
Yeah. And
it's
you
a
looking
place of public grief as well.
And you looking at the front page of the Daily Mail, here we go, in front. Front page story is Poppy Seller 78 punched by protesters. Veteran tells Mail of station attack as leaders of Gaza march on Hamas estate, refuse police plea to cancel. I mean, what does this tell you about the demonstrators? That here was a 78-year-old veteran, I think he was in the Paras, was punched a couple of times because he was selling poppies.
It's just I think this is an indication of what could happen. I mean, Jim Henderson is his name, and I think this happened at Waverley Station in Edinburgh. But it's an indication of the sort of thing that could happen over this coming weekend on Armistice Day. And if I may, I would like to just read part of an article written by Anthony Julius in the Times, and this is what he wrote. He said, "At the university where I teach in London, the local branch of the Lecturers' Union has just passed a motion calling for intifada until victory. The university's Jewish Studies Department notifies students of lecture venues by text for fear of disruption. Students at Jewish Society lunches are protected by guards. Jewish students stay on campus for only as long as they need to, then leave. The general sentiment is better to conceal all signs of their Jewishness." And this is the way that our country seems to be going. And that's another reason why this needs to be stopped over the weekend, I believe, because the Jewish people that I've come across are now living in fear. And, you know, to have this 85 years after Kristallnacht in 1938 is just appalling, really.
Can you imagine what it's like for the Holocaust survivors who will remember Kristallnacht?
Well, let's not forget that one of the hostages is a Holocaust survivor, was taken by Hamas into Gaza. So having twice experienced unbelievable trauma in her life, is now a hostage of Hamas, which is beyond horrific. But Alistair, you know, thankfully we live in a democracy, and part of that democracy is the right to demonstrate, to have protests, which is all well and good. But what we're seeing on our streets now is one of hatred, anti-Semitism, calls for jihad, chants of genocide that are occurring on our major streets, that is not only threatening the security and the well-being of our Jewish community that contributes so much to British life, but it is also sowing the seeds for Islamic terrorist attacks in this country. For that reason alone, shouldn't the police and the government and the local authorities be strong enough to say enough's enough, no more of these protests?
Totally agree. And I mean, I think even if you think of recent past where there seems to be an underlying law. I mean, I agree with you that we have the right to express our opinions, demonstrate in a peaceful manner. When it gets into violence, obviously it needs to stop. But you know, we talked about this in one of the programs before, about the woman who was arrested for thinking prayers. She wasn't even praying.
That was at an abortion clinic.
Yeah, at the abortion clinic, because it was an incitement to intimidation. And now, what is this if it's not intimidating? What, you know, when people are shouting out against the Jews, kill the Jews, they're even shouting that in our nation. That is intimidation, and surely that's enough reason to stop it from happening. You know, there have been so many incidents of Christianity being stopped. Even you know, the old guy who was just preaching the gospel in the streets, and the police came and took him away and handcuffed him because it intimidated or incited somebody else who wasn't a believer, and he reported to the police, and the police took action. So I mean, it seems that these things are going on anyway if you don't fit into the stream of what the world is thinking. You know, we don't want to use the words that you know I'm thinking about, but surely this has got the potential of being far more dangerous than a woman praying silently without any words coming out, being arrested and rearrested a second time.
Absolutely.
Then this potential of people who will be shouting, they will be screaming, they will be intimidating, they will be coming against older folk who are honoring and remembering their colleagues who died on the battlefield and they're still living. So come on, we have to take actions to make sure that this is a day that is what it's meant to be.
We've got 2 minutes left of the programme. Hugh, so there's 2 points I want to really make. The first one is that a few weeks ago there was a pro-Israel prayer vigil. This was a prayer vigil being organised by Tim Gutman and his wife for Golders Green to bring comfort to the Jewish people there who are feeling scared as a show of Christian support and solidarity, and the police stopped it. And what we've seen, sadly, over the last few weeks is that the Palestinians can have their marches, but when it comes to marching for Israel or waving the Israeli flag, they're saying it's too dangerous and we can't police it. And therefore the only things that we've seen is the protest that you were involved in, that was outside the BBC, or the other one having a demonstration to bring the kidnapped hostages home from Gaza. That's it.
Yes.
So share with us how, you know, this is not a level playing field.
Definitely.
Well, it's definitely not a level playing field at all, because what Tim Gutman organised, and you had him on a couple of weeks ago, it simply got cancelled altogether. Now, I was at another thing on Tuesday of this week. It happened just after the King's speech.
So I'm going to have to stop you there, Hugh.
Yeah,
I'll come
okay.
to an end. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Hugh, so much for being my guest on this week's Politics Today. If you care about this nation, if you care about the Jewish people, then this is a time of serious intercession and prayer. We need to pray for the peace of our streets as we pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And we need to pray for wisdom for the police and also our government at this very difficult time. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.